The USS Liberty's resolve drifted into position above the neutral trade station, its sleek, reinforced hull reflecting the cold light of distant stars. Captain Sarah Locke adjusted the cuffs of her suit jacket, the diplomatic attire, a far cry from the combat gear she once wore as a Marine sniper. The mission was clear: negotiate trade and defense agreements with the Galactic Empire. But she felt the weight of something unspoken in the air, an unease pressing at the back of her mind like the moment before a rifle's recoil. Inside the station's sterile, silver-lit corridors, the Empire's delegation awaited. Admiral Xiron, a towering, reptilian warlord, stood at the center, his gleaming black armor reflecting the ambient glow of overhead lighting. His subordinates, clad in polished ceremonial garb, flanked him in silent intimidation. Despite their outward civility, Locke caught the telltale twitch of their claws, the faint scent of charged plasma weapons beneath their ornate robes. She kept her expression neutral, measured. Her years of battlefield patience carried over to diplomacy, but she never abandoned instinct. Colonel Jack Monroe, her lead security officer, stood behind her, a broad-shouldered man with storm-gray eyes and the unreadable face of someone who had seen too much. To his left, Sergeant Victor Kane subtly adjusted his wrist-mounted scanner, disguised as a diplomatic assistant's data pad. His fingers moved with the kind of efficiency that only a demolitions expert possessed. Locke stepped forward. "Admiral Xiron, on behalf of the United States and its allied colonies, I appreciate your willingness to engage in open discussion." Xiron's lip curled. "Indeed, Captain Locke. It is rare for the lesser species to speak with such confidence." The insult was expected. Locke remained still, her voice steady. "We've built our place among the stars. You'll find we are not as insignificant as some might assume." The Admiral exhaled sharply through his nostrils, a sound akin to a growl. The exchange continued, a delicate game of verbal maneuvering, but something was wrong. Monroe shifted subtly, his stance tightening. Kane's fingers tapped a silent pattern against his data pad. They sensed it, too. Then it happened. The station's lights flickered. A metallic hiss reverberated through the chamber, followed by a deep, resonant boom. The shockwave hit first, rattling the floor beneath them. A second later, the far wall erupted in fire and shrapnel as explosive charges detonated with surgical precision. Locke moved on instinct, diving behind the conference table as kinetic rounds ripped through the air. The Empire's guards fell, cut down by their own side before they could react. Betrayal. Monroe had already drawn his sidearm, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Locke, move." Kane dropped low, pressing his data pad against the floor. A nearby console flickered, hacked and compromised within seconds. "They've locked down all exits. We're cut off." Locke's pulse steadied. She had been out of combat for years, but the instincts never faded. Her gaze snapped to the smoke-filled breach where elite Imperial shock troops flooded in, their rifles glowing with pre-charged energy. They weren't here for a battle. They were here for an execution. Monroe took point, firing a precise shot that punched through an enemy's helmet, sending the body crashing backward. Kane followed suit, tossing an improvised plasma charge that detonated midair, forcing the advancing soldiers into cover. Locke scanned the battlefield, her mind already calculating angles, vectors, advantages. They needed a higher position. "South corridor," she ordered. "That leads to the maintenance shafts." Monroe nodded, laying down covering fire as the team moved. The station's design worked against them, Empire standard, meant to funnel movement into choke points. But Locke had spent years in sniper nests, learning how to see opportunity in confined spaces. As they sprinted through the dimly lit halls, she spotted a maintenance panel barely visible against the wall. "Kane, pop it open." A second explosion rocked the station, sending tremors through the structure. Kane worked fast, pulling the panel loose, revealing a narrow vent system running behind the bulkheads. They had seconds. Monroe covered their retreat, taking down another soldier before ducking into the passage. Locke was the last one in, sliding the panel shut just as another wave of troops stormed past. They moved in near silence through the tight space, the dim emergency lights casting faint orange shadows. The situation was clear. Diplomacy was over. The Empire had lured them in under the guise of peace, never expecting resistance. It was a mistake. Locke whispered into her comm, "Status on our extraction?" "Static." Then a voice, distorted but recognizable. "Evac under heavy fire." They hit the ship's docking clamps. The USS Liberty's resolve was trapped. The Empire wanted to eliminate them without a trace. Monroe exhaled slowly. "They're making this personal." Locke's fingers clenched around the grip of her concealed sidearm. "Then so will we." Emerging into an abandoned industrial wing, they found themselves in a graveyard of obsolete machinery, mining rigs, decommissioned drones, and rusted cargo haulers. A place forgotten by time. Kane scanned the equipment, already seeing the same thing Locke did. Resources. Weapons. Options. "We can make this work," Kane muttered, eyeing a stack of old fusion cells. "Give me an hour, and I can rig some surprises." Monroe nodded. "We don't need to win a war. We just need to make them bleed." Locke stepped forward, her voice steady. "The Empire thinks they've already won. They don't realize that humans don't fight fair." Monroe smirked. "They're about to learn." From the shadows of a dying station, the first strike of resistance had begun. The glow of emergency lighting flickered across rusted metal, casting long, fractured shadows through the maintenance wing. The hum of distant machinery mixed with the steady, calculated breaths of the men crouched behind crates of outdated mining equipment. Colonel Jack Monroe scanned the corridor ahead, his pulse steady, his grip firm on the rifle he had salvaged from a fallen Imperial soldier. They weren't just surviving, they were planning. Kane knelt beside a stripped-down fusion core, his fingers working with mechanical precision. He had cracked open its shielding, exposing the volatile energy cell within. With a few adjustments and a repurposed relay coil, he could turn it into a proximity mine capable of disabling energy weapons in a controlled radius. It wasn't about raw power, it was about advantage. Locke watched the process with a practiced eye, her expression unreadable. She was leaning against a cargo hauler, cradling a sniper rifle she had pieced together from scavenged parts. The weapon was a crude assembly of mismatched Imperial components and human ingenuity, but in her hands it was lethal. Her injuries had slowed her, but not enough to dull her focus. "The Empire still thinks we are running," she murmured, adjusting the rifle's improvised sight. "They haven't realized we're setting the stage." Monroe gave a slow nod. "We make them doubt. Turn their strength against them." The sound of marching boots echoed from the corridor beyond. Imperial patrols were sweeping through the station in staggered rotations, using thermal scanners to track movement. But the station's industrial sector was old, its infrastructure incompatible with their technology. That gave the Americans an edge. Kane set the mine in place, tucking it beneath a collapsed walkway. "They'll think it's just another power surge," he muttered, standing, "until their weapons shut down." Monroe gestured for them to move. They slipped into the shadows, navigating through access tunnels and forgotten maintenance shafts, always staying ahead of the enemy's search patterns. Every patrol that passed them carried the same overconfidence, the assumption that humans could only run, never fight. They reached an abandoned cargo bay, its ceiling lined with rusted catwalks. It was a perfect kill box. Monroe signaled to Locke, who climbed with practiced ease, her movements controlled despite her injuries. She positioned herself behind a collapsed railing, steadying her rifle. Kane and Monroe stayed below, concealed behind a half-toppled storage container. The first patrol entered moments later. 5 soldiers in sleek, black armor, their helmets pulsing with soft blue light as they scanned the room. They moved with military precision, fanning out weapons raised. One tapped a wrist-mounted scanner, unaware that Kane's mind had already disrupted its readings. Locke exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The shot was near silent, the rifle's makeshift suppressor dulling the crack of energy discharge. The lead soldier's helmet snapped backward, his body crumpling to the floor. The others hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough. Monroe moved, emerging from cover with calculated aggression. His stolen rifle barked, dropping the second target before the remaining soldiers could react. Kane lunged forward, planting a knife between the joints of a third's armor before pivoting and firing a plasma bolt into the fourth. The last soldier spun toward the catwalk, raising his weapon at Locke's position. Then his rifle powered down. Kane's mine had done its job. The soldier hesitated, confused. Locke didn't. Her second shot took him in the throat. The bodies hit the ground in eerie silence. Monroe motioned for Kane to retrieve any usable equipment while he dragged the corpses out of sight. They worked quickly, efficiently, making sure to leave no trace that could compromise their movements. When it was done, they disappeared back into the maintenance tunnels. As they moved, Locke tapped into a stolen Imperial comlink, listening to the fractured, distorted transmissions between enemy units. Panic was setting in. The Empire was used to overwhelming firepower, to crushing their enemies beneath sheer force. But now their officers were dead, their patrols were vanishing, and their scanners were failing. The Americans were rewriting the rules of engagement. "They're diverting more troops to this sector," Locke reported. "They think we're a larger force." Monroe allowed himself a small smile. "Good. Let's keep them guessing." They reached an old control station, its walls lined with outdated terminal screens displaying garbled data. Kane immediately got to work, fingers flying across the interface. He bypassed layers of Imperial security, digging into the station's core systems. "They rerouted command to a secondary hub," he muttered. "If we get control of it, we can lock them out of their own defense grid." Monroe glanced at the map flickering on screen. "How far?" "Half a click. Problem is, it's in their hands." Locke stood, sliding a fresh charge into her rifle. "Then we take it back." They moved with purpose, navigating through the industrial sector until they reached a reinforced corridor. Beyond it lay the Empire's temporary command post, a fortified security station they had turned into their nerve center. Monroe studied the defenses. The enemy had barricaded the entrance, stationing guards at key choke points. Automated turrets lined the ceiling, scanning for movement. A direct assault was suicide, but Monroe had never been interested in direct assaults. "We go through the vents," he said. "Kane, you plant a charge on their generator. When it blows, Locke takes out their officers. The rest will panic." Kane nodded, already assembling the explosive. Locke positioned herself at an elevated vantage point, sighting down her rifle. Monroe waited, timing his approach. Kane slipped into the maintenance ducts, moving with practiced silence. He reached the generator room, its walls humming with the pulse of stored energy. Carefully, he set the charge beneath the main relay. Then he whispered into the comm, "Set." Monroe exhaled. "Do it." The explosion was sharp and sudden, a controlled burst that sent a ripple of darkness through the corridor. The automated turrets powered down. The soldiers inside the security station scrambled, shouting orders into failing comms. Locke fired. Her first shot punched through a lieutenant's visor, sending his body crumpling against the console. The second struck another officer before he could react. The remaining soldiers faltered. Monroe and Kane struck fast. They breached the entrance, cutting down disoriented guards before they could regroup. Within moments, the station was theirs. Kane moved to the main console, working quickly. "I can reroute their security overrides," he said. "Give us access to the outer docking controls." Locke kept watch, scanning the corridors. "They'll know something's wrong." Monroe reloaded his rifle. "Then we make sure they can't do anything about it." As Kane locked down the system, Monroe turned to Locke. The station was still hostile territory. The Empire would regroup. But for the first time since the ambush, the Americans had control. "We're turning this fight around," Monroe said. Locke met his gaze, her expression resolute. "Then let's make sure they regret starting it." The station trembled under the strain of battle, distant explosions rattling through the steel framework. The lights flickered, casting fractured shadows across the command room's walls. Colonel Jack Monroe stood at the center, his rifle cradled in his arms, his expression grim. The Americans had seized control of the security station, but the Empire wouldn't stay blind for long. Their counterattack was inevitable. Victor Kane worked quickly at the console, his fingers dancing over the Imperial interface. He had managed to override a handful of security protocols, granting them temporary control of the station's internal systems. But it wasn't enough. Every second counted. "They're trying to re-establish command from the main operations center," Kane muttered, his voice tight with concentration. "If they lock us out, we lose access to the docking bay." Sarah Locke adjusted her rifle, her gaze sharp as she watched the corridor outside. "Then we don't give them the chance." Monroe studied the hollow map flickering on the console. The main operations center was heavily fortified, a central hub connected to multiple access points across the station. It wasn't just a control room, it was the Empire's last stronghold here. And they knew it. They'll be dug in, Monroe said. They expect us to come through the main corridors. Locke exhaled slowly, shifting her stance. So we don't. The silence that followed carried understanding. The Empire had underestimated them at every turn, relying on superior firepower and battlefield control. That advantage was slipping. The humans weren't just surviving, they were adapting, learning the enemy's weaknesses, turning the battlefield against them. Kane pulled up the maintenance schematics, his eyes scanning for vulnerabilities. Then he found it. There's an auxiliary vent system, he said. Runs parallel to the main corridor. It's supposed to be a failsafe for radiation leaks, but if we override the access protocols, we can use it. Monroe nodded. How close does it get us? Right under them, Kane said. We can plant charges along the support beams. Bring the ceiling down on their heads. Locke was already securing her gear. Then let's move. They navigated the maintenance tunnels in silence, their movements swift, controlled. The Empire's soldiers were tightening their patrols, searching for any sign of resistance. But the Americans had learned to move in the shadows, using the station's infrastructure against its own creators. Kane reached the access panel first, working quickly to bypass the security lock. The mechanism hissed open, revealing a narrow crawlspace lined with corroded metal grating. The air was thick with dust and the scent of burning circuitry. Monroe led the way, moving with deliberate precision. Every inch forward brought them closer to the enemy's command post. Above them, the muffled voices of Imperial officers barked orders, their boots striking the floor in clipped, methodical movements. Locke adjusted her rifle's sight. Kane set the charges. We hit them fast. Kane moved efficiently, planting explosive packs along the structural beams. The charges weren't meant for destruction, they were meant for disruption. The moment they detonated, chaos would follow. And in chaos, the Americans thrived. Monroe tapped his earpiece. Ready. Kane gave a sharp nod. Detonating in 3. The blast wasn't deafening, but was precise. The floor above them buckled, the structure groaning, under the sudden shift. Shouts of confusion erupted from the command room. Dust and debris rained down as the Empire's officers stumbled to react. That was all the opening they needed. Locke moved first, emerging through the weakened flooring with practiced speed. Her rifle snapped up, the first shot tearing through an officer's chest before he could reach for his weapon. Monroe followed, his stolen rifle barking, as he put down 2 more enemies in rapid succession. The Imperials scrambled, caught between the sudden collapse and the unseen enemy among them. They had prepared for an assault through the main doors, not for the very ground beneath them to give way. Kane fired a shot that shattered a command terminal, sparks cascading through the air. They won't be locking us out now. Locke swung her rifle toward the remaining enemy forces. You want to live, she said coldly. Stand down. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then an Imperial officer, his armor stained with dust, reached for his sidearm. Locke didn't hesitate. The shot rang out, precise, final. The officer crumpled to the floor. Monroe stepped forward, scanning the remaining soldiers. The fight was over, and they knew it. Kane moved back to the console, working through the security protocols. We have full control, he confirmed. Docking clamps are released. We can get to the Liberty's resolve. Monroe exhaled, adrenaline still burning through his system. Then let's go before they get reinforcements. Locke secured her rifle, giving the room one last glance. The Empire had thought itself invincible, unchallengeable. But the Americans had shown them otherwise. They weren't just fighting back. They were winning. The docking bay was a war zone. Plasma fire streaked through the air, scorching metal and leaving glowing scars on the station's infrastructure. The towering blast doors, once a symbol of Imperial control, now stood half open, their mechanisms jammed by Kane's last-minute sabotage. Smoke billowed from the shattered remains of an Imperial hover tank, its wreckage sprawled across the deck like a fallen beast. Colonel Jack Monroe moved with precision, his stolen rifle spitting fire as he led the final push toward the Liberty's resolve, the last ship standing between them and escape. The transport's engines roared, its thrusters straining against the station's failing gravity stabilizers. Every second counted. Move! Now! Monroe barked over the gunfire. Locke took position behind a fallen cargo hauler, her rifle finding targets with mechanical efficiency. Every shot she fired sent an Imperial soldier crashing to the floor, their armor smoking from precision energy burns. She had no time for hesitation, no room for mistakes. The moment she stopped moving was the moment she died. Kane was already at the ship's ramp, his fingers flying across the remote console strapped to his wrist. "I've got the airlock primed. Just get on board." Monroe sprinted forward, his rifle dropping to his side as he grabbed Locke's arm, yanking her toward the ship. Plasma bolts sizzled past, the air thick with the acrid scent of burning polymers and superheated metal. Locke didn't resist. She knew when to press forward and when to retreat. They had done what they came to do. Now survival was the mission. A mechanical screech echoed from the far side of the hangar. Monroe turned just in time to see the final wave of Imperial reinforcements pouring through the main corridor. Black-clad soldiers advanced in a tight formation, energy shields flickering as they absorbed incoming fire. Behind them, a towering exosuit thundered into view, its massive frame bristling with plasma cannons and hydraulic servos. Kane swore. They brought a heavy. Locke was already adjusting her aim, but Monroe knew they didn't have the time for a prolonged fight. The exosuit's targeting array whirred, locking onto the Liberty's resolve with deadly precision. "They're going to take out the engines." Kane shouted. Monroe made a split-second decision. He yanked a plasma grenade from his belt and sprinted toward the nearest maintenance platform. He climbed fast, boots clanging against the metal rungs. The exosuit's cannons swiveled, tracking him now, the Empire recognizing the real threat. "Jack!" Locke's voice cut through the chaos. "Get on the ship." Monroe yelled back. "That's an order." The first plasma cannon fired, missing by inches. The heat singed his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He reached the top of the platform, his muscles burning as he vaulted onto a hanging crane arm. The exosuit turned, its targeting software struggling to adjust. Monroe pulled the grenade's pin. The moment stretched. The Empire had underestimated humans at every turn. They had assumed superior numbers, superior firepower, and superior technology would always win. They had forgotten one thing. Monroe let the grenade drop. The explosion ripped through the exosuit's exposed hydraulics, sending a shockwave through the docking bay. The massive machine staggered, its legs locking up as its own weight became its downfall. It collapsed with a deafening crash, crushing half the remaining Imperial forces beneath it. The remaining soldiers hesitated, their cohesion shattered. That hesitation was their last mistake. Locke fired first, taking down the highest-ranking officer in the group. Kane overloaded the ship's external turret, sending a stream of suppressive fire into the disoriented Imperials. Monroe hit the deck hard, rolling with the impact before scrambling to his feet. He sprinted for the ramp, lungs burning, his boots pounding against the scorched floor. Locke was waiting at the top, rifle still hot in her hands. "You're insane," she muttered as she pulled him aboard. "Yeah," Monroe agreed, gasping for breath. But it worked. Kane slammed the control panel, and the ship's airlock sealed with a pressurized hiss. The moment they were secure, the thrusters ignited, and Liberty's resolve surged forward. The station shrank behind them, the flashing red of emergency sirens visible even from space. Locke dropped into the co-pilot's seat, her hands moving over the controls with practiced efficiency. "They'll send fighters after us." "They'll try," Monroe said, strapping in. "But we've already won." Kane brought up the sensor display, a slow grin spreading across his face. Jump coordinates set. Ready to disappear. Monroe took one last look at the station, now just a speck against the void. The Empire had tried to break them, to erase them as just another footnote in their conquest. Instead, the Americans had proven, once again, that humanity didn't break. It adapted. It survived. And always fought back. The ship's engines flared, and Liberty's resolve vanished into the stars.